without further ado, I will let Jared Callahan introduce our Science on Tap speaker.
So Joe hired me to do this, and because he was afraid of things that people might say about him otherwise. Anyway, Joe and I have known each other for a long time. Joe and I were at Scripps Clinic together, about over 40 years ago. We were roommates for a year. Joe introduced me some remarkable things like Monty Python, for example. And yeah, we'll go through the usual stuff that everyone knows about Joe, and then I got a couple other things I'll share with you just quickly. So Joe has been at NPR since 1999. He's two? He really wasn't that good for the first 7 years. Anyway, and we all have.
You got the truth.
We have all learned a great deal from Joe because he is so skilled at what he does and been fascinated by the way he communicates science and the number and the variety and depth of things he communicates in a very short period of time is remarkable. Also, Joe has, as I mentioned earlier today, has a list of awards longer than my arm that range from the most remarkable to the sort of almost unremarkable.
No award is too small. That's one, I'll take it.
Yeah. And as he pointed out, some of them come with very nice pieces of paper as well, so there's a lot of reason to admire what Joe has done. Seriously, he's a remarkable science correspondent. He has done a great deal for the nation and also for our international reputation, I think, as people who are interested in and can communicate science. But I do have two things to tell you about Joe briefly that are little known. One is it turns out that Joe is hourly paid by NPR. It's true. They've never been willing to put him on salary, so he really. I read this. This is not. I'm not making this up. I found this online. He goes to work at 8 in the morning and he leaves at 5 because they don't like to pay overtime. So Joe does that, and he has lunch every day at exactly noon. And in fact, it is said that it's mostly known in Washington D.C. that the National Institute of Standards actually has a webcam that is focused on Joe's table. And when he shows up at noon, they reset the atomic clock. Anyway, I want to thank you for being here, Joe, and please enjoy.
I think what's going to happen is they're going to have to widen the door to get my head out. Please, if any of you want to come up here and sit down, you're more than welcome. I feel kind of lonely up here, and if you're standing, you can sit. No, I don't. I take a shower. Okay. I don't offend. All right. Well, no. Okay. Hi, everyone. This is. You don't know how bad. I finally figured it out. You know, free beer really will bring a big crowd. So I'm deciding that's what I'm going to tell my wife. She's just going to go, no way, people can hear you. Oh my God. That's what happens at NPR. You know, you're just, oh yeah, it's Joe. And then here I'm Joe Palca, and it's just like, what happened to being Joe Palca? Oh yeah, you're Joe Palca. Where's the script you owe us? You know. I am gobsmacked. This is an amazing, nice thing, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what I do and some of the stuff. But it's true what Terry's. Whether I'm good at it or not is up to you. But the things that I've gotten to see and do in the course of my jobs, and I'm going to tell you about all of them, has just been spectacular. And I was making a list of my greatest hits. I decided I'd write out my speech tonight. So. But it really is stunning, and I've seen the drawback to getting old, of course, is that you're getting old. But the good thing is that you get to see the sweep of things happening. And so I was going to share with you some of the things that I thought were most amusing. And then remind me if I don't, I want to explain the story of snail sex, because I went back. I don't know. I'm assuming that most of you came because you saw the poster and it said snail sex, and that you thought, ooh. Sort of slow-mo. But then I had to go back and listen to the story again because I couldn't remember it that well. That really freaked me out. So I realized I had become a little bit jaded when I was at an event with John Mather, who's the Nobel Prize winning physicist who worked on the cosmic background experiment, and he won with I forget what the other guy's name is. Anyway, come back to me. So I was doing an event with him, and I said, "Hi, it's nice to meet you." And he said, "Oh yeah, we've met before. You remember you interviewed me?" And I went, "Uh-oh." So when you forget that you've interviewed a Nobel Prize winner before, you kind of realize, "Oh yeah, okay, I've done that." So many of you know or have heard that I started out. I didn't start intending to be Joe Palca. My initial idea was to be a researcher and a sleep researcher, but I found that tiring. No, it's funny. I actually got bored because every single reasonable question that you could ask about sleep can't be answered. Why do we sleep? I don't know. How much is enough sleep? I don't know. Well, what if I can't sleep? Well, I don't know. And I got tired, we'd be going to parties and say, "Oh, I have a sleep problem." Oh, that's too bad. Can't help you. So I got a fellowship in 1981, and I wound up in television. Oh my God. Not just television, but what I consider to be, I'm going to insult somebody in the room, but what I consider to be the lowest form of journalism, which is local TV news. Does the phrase, "if it bleeds, it leads," mean anything to you? Or, as we also say, the formula, tits, tots, and pets? It actually works at NPR too, but I don't like to tell people that. It's just so banal. I mean, you would be going off to interview somebody who's just, I don't know, pick your favorite scientist, some incredible piece of information, and they take your crew away because there was an accident on the Beltway or something like that. The perspective, there's always, every day there's an accident on the Beltway, but anyway. So I was doing that, and I was actually plucked from this ridiculous existence, which I found myself in because that's where I started in journalism. When I was sitting at my desk one day and the phone rings and it was the editor of Nature saying, "How would you like to come work for us in the Washington office?" Now, people say, "How do you start your career?" That's my advice. Wait for the phone to ring. Editor of Nature call you up and say, "Come and work for me." It certainly was the way I got started, and I said, "Well, okay." And that's really, I actually started on January 2nd, 1986, and it was really, that's when I consider my journalism career to start, because the first day, actually just even before I went to work, the very first day, the deputy editor of Nature called me up and said, "Look, I'm really sorry to do this. I know you've just started, but there's a conference on January 3rd that I can't go to. I was supposed to go, and could you go for me?" I said, "Okay, what is it?" And he said, "Well, it's a conference on AIDS, viral associated cancer and AIDS, and it's in Martinique." And I'm in Washington and it's snowing. He said, "Martinique, you say?" And I was terrified because I was, I'd never written for Nature, I'd never written for anybody actually, and I didn't know what to do. And so I figured what I'd do is I'd go to every single session that Jean Marks went to. She was the science correspondent. So I figured she's not going to get out of my sight. And I figured anything she goes to, I'll go to, and that way I won't get scooped. And then I realized what a dope she is, because the conference, interesting stuff, was out by the beach where all the people were. But it was actually the first time that they reported successful use of AZT. And oh my goodness, and there's Gallo and Montagnier being nice to each other. Didn't help, but it was remarkable. And then 3 weeks after that, Nature went to press on Monday afternoon in London. And talk about, here's technology for you. When I got to Nature, they didn't own a computer. I owned a computer, but Nature didn't own a computer. And so we would type our stories out and fax them to London. And then in London, they would type them in and print them out and take them over to the typesetter, and the typesetter would type them into their computer. It was like playing telephone. But so on the Monday, the third Monday I was there, or fourth Monday, the Challenger accident occurred in 1986. And I remember calling John. John Maddox was the editor of Nature. He was already at the printer, because he usually didn't write his editorials until the night of, and he's at the printer and he'd write it. You know, how many more words do I need to write those? Remarkable guy. And I thought, oh man, this is such big news. And he said, oh yeah, I'm surprised it didn't happen before this. So anyway, he was a remarkable guy. That was the start. Oh, the other thing I did that first year, which has come back into common usage, is, does anybody know about the coordinated framework for the release of bioengineered organisms? Is that something anybody works on? So the US government was trying to figure out what to do about genetically modified crops and things. And so there was this amazing discussion among the agencies, and I actually, that's the last time I really did investigative reporting, because I had a mole who was telling me what was going on in the meetings, and I broke the news. I was very happy about that. I also broke the news, and this is actually the first, in 1986, the first story in the news, journalism, because the front of Nature was considered a news organization. I wrote the first article about the Human Genome Project. It was a meeting after it took place in Santa Fe, organized by Los Alamos, where all the DOE people went, and they said, we're going to do this, and everybody went, ha, 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 ha. And I wrote about it, and they did it, because I wrote about it. Anyway, after 3.5 years at Nature, I got traded to Science for a future draft pick. It was a hard decision to make. I think Nature was a lot more nimble of a news organization, but it was also like you had to write the entire news section if one person got sick. So it was a very small operation, and it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of work. And when I got to Science, it was like, oh, there's 10 reporters doing this, you know, 20 reporters. It was amazing. And what I've noticed is that every time I've advanced in my career, I've had to do less work. Because I was talking to the people at KUNC and saying how many stories I did for a year, and I think that the woman was going to faint because I do so few. She does as many in a month as I do in a year, which is kind of sad. But I got to Science. I never get to do that. I got to Science, and I did a story which I think is oddly prophetic, called Young Investigators at Risk. And it was a story about how young scientists starting out were having a really hard time finding money. 1981. And it's partly why Harold Varmus decided to get into science policy, because he realized that there was a problem, and he was going to go double the NIH budget, which he did. And now people say, why the hell did you double the NIH budget? Now we expect that kind of money every year. We don't get it. So it's an interesting conundrum that he walked himself into. The other thing that happened while I was at Science was I went to the South Pole. And so every year the National Science Foundation, which does all the research at the South Pole, sends people down there as journalists, and they invite you to propose stories, and if they accept you, you go. So I proposed them, and I said I'd like to go. And they said sure. So I went into my editor at Science, and I said, I got picked to go to the South Pole, or to Antarctica and the South Pole, for the NSF junket this year. And my editor said, oh, we're not interested. I said, what? And he said, no, that's nothing happening. No, we're not, And I said, you are crazy, I'm going. And he said, fine, take vacation. And he made me take vacation to go to the South Pole. And then, this is why I got pissed off and left. He ran the story. I wrote a story. We traded my plane fare. Still made me take vacation. Traded my plane fare for the 3 or 4 page story I wrote about the South Pole and all the research that was going on there. And this is me. I took a copy of Science with me down to the pole, and I had a picture of me reading Science magazine at the South Pole. And I said to the marketing people, you might want this. And they said, oh, that's great. I said, how much are you going to pay me for it? And they said, what do you mean, you're our employee? We own all your stuff. And I said, yeah, but I was on vacation. And they said, yeah, but you're our employee. And they didn't pay me a cent after making me take vacation to get the picture. And I decided it was a good time to take a pay cut and a temporary job at NPR. And that's what happened. And you know, I was mad at the time, and I still get mad when I talk about it. You can tell it still pisses me off. But it turned out to be a good thing. So I got to NPR in 1992, in October. In 1993, it was the 40th anniversary of the DNA paper in Science and Nature. And so they had a big soiree at Cold Spring Harbor, and I have this great tape of Crick and Watson trying to remember the dates that they did various things and pushing them on. That was hilarious, and I did a 40th anniversary piece about 6 months after I got to NPR, and that was when I won my first prize, because the piece got an award from a journalism organization. It was great. You know, and since then, oh gosh, all sorts of crazy stuff has happened. Anybody remember Dolly the sheep? That was a big one. Anybody remember Richard Seed? That was my all-time biggest, #1, most impactful story with no news and totally unimportant, but it was crazy. So Richard Seed was this guy who, I don't know how, it's usually at physics conferences, but there's somebody who usually comes in with this giant bag of aluminum cans, and he's got tin foil on his head, and he's got a theory about how the universe formed, and he tries to get the attention of the people at the conference, and they're going, oh God. And then, so this guy, Richard Seed, was at a conference on the ethical, legal, social issues relating to cloning, and he stood up at the back and said, I'm going to clone human beings. And everybody went, oh, okay. And then they went on with their conference, and somebody from a local NPR station was there at the conference and said, that's what this guy said. And I said, my editor said, at NPR, said, why don't you check this out? And I said, come on. And she said, no, check it out. So I checked it out. And the guy he's a PhD physicist from Harvard, but he had gotten interested in mammalian reproduction and had worked in cattle, as it turns out. But he was going to try this with people. And I said, well, you can't do it on your own. And he said, I have a fertility clinic here in Chicago that's willing to do this with me. And I said, okay, I'll fly to Chicago and I'll interview you, but I want to meet the doctor who's going to do this procedure for you. So I went to Chicago. I interviewed him, and he's a wonderful nutcase. He really was. He was delightful. But I'm having lunch with him at like the Howard Johnson or something like that. I'm thinking, if this guy really is successful, I'm sitting and just chatting with a guy who's going to be the most famous scientist in the world. But obviously, he's still not recognized. Well, he's dead now, but he was never recognized after that. But I did meet the doctor who said he was going to do it. And my point in the story that I wrote was, it's not that Richard Seed could succeed at doing this, which I said I didn't think he could, but there was nothing to stop him. There were no federal regulations, there were no laws, there were no... So if he wanted to... Ethicists went, but there was nothing to stop him. And so I did this story, and suddenly, what everybody hears in the media is not, here's a regulatory problem, but Richard Seed's going to clone human beings. So I was on CNN as the expert because they couldn't find him. And all kinds of stuff like that. So it's a huge story, and it actually did lead to congressional hearings and FDA regulations and all kinds of stuff, just because I said, here's this guy and there's nothing to stop him. And so it turned out to be a good story, but there was also, I got a lot of criticism from my journalistic colleagues, some of them, who said, he's a nutcase, he's never going to do this. And they also, I think some of them missed the point. I didn't say he could do it. I said he wanted to try, and no one could stop him at the time. Anyway, half an hour, they said. One of the most exciting stories I did was the first Mars landing of the little rover Sojourner and the Pathfinder mission. And that was really a lot of fun. But I took a very science nature kind of approach to that. instead of just waiting for the press conference and going to JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and doing it like everybody else, I spent 6 months interviewing every single scientist, everybody on every single scientific instrument. So I knew the entire team, and I knew all the engineers. And then when I got to JPL, I was herded into the pen with all the other journalists, and they wouldn't let me talk to any of the people that I knew. But the crazy thing was they had a video feed of the NASA control room, and I said, can I talk to so-and-so, who I knew? And NASA press people said, no, he's too busy. So I called him on my cell phone, and I could see him on the video feed talking to me. It was very satisfying. But I think what made Pathfinder so remarkable, and I might be confused, that might have been the next rover mission, but what made Pathfinder so remarkable was it was like the entire crew that worked on it were like the number of people in this room. They designed, built, and ready for launch, and wrote the software to send something to Mars that worked. I mean, it was never much of a scientific instrument, but oh my goodness, was it a mind blower of landing something on Mars and having it roll around. So every single success, there's been 6 or 7, I think, successful Mars missions since that one, or including that one, that have landed safely. And I've been to all of them, and the only one that failed I didn't go to. At Jet Propulsion Laboratory, I didn't go to Mars. And so I've informed NASA that if they want to have a successful mission, they better keep me around. SARS, anybody remember SARS? That was the most scared I ever was, because people, I mean, I've done things, I went to Fukushima to cover the nuclear accident, but I went after the first wave, and it was clear that it was going to be dangerous right around the power plant, but it wasn't going to be dangerous in Tokyo at this point. It probably wasn't ever. But anyway, and people said, but aren't you scared? And I said, what, of eating too much in the hotel I'm going to be staying in? That was all we did. It's the faux part of journalism that I don't like. Here I am in Japan, and I'm just watching television in a hotel room and getting some Joe Palca, NPR News, Tokyo. So what? I tried to tell them they should get a feed into the Japanese embassy and we could go there and somebody'd have to stay up all night, but what the hell? But that didn't fly. So SARS, but what I really was scared about was SARS, mostly because nobody really knew how it was transmitted when I started covering it. And so I went to, they wanted one of us, Richard Harris went to Peking, Beijing, and I went to Hong Kong, where the outbreak originated but was largely under control by the time. The situation in Beijing was a little more fluid. Hong Kong was pretty much under control. And I landed, it was a very strange, I took a Cathay Pacific flight. I was the only person who actually came out of the airport, out of customs in Hong Kong airport. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to Hong Kong airport. I've only been that one time, but it's usually crowded. And when a 747 lands, usually several hundred people get off, and it was one. Everybody else on the plane was transiting to some other location. This is crazy. But I was really nervous, and I went and they wanted me to wear this industrial mask, and I couldn't stand it. It was like hot and sticky, and I couldn't breathe, and I said, get me out of here. So I said, look, I'd rather die, and I took it off. And I went to interview this scientist who was working on SARS, and he thought he'd figured out what it was. It turns out he thought it was a coronavirus. And so he wasn't wearing a mask, but he wouldn't shake my hand. And I figured, okay, I can live with that. I won't shake anybody's hand. So, but I was really nervous. And at the time, they wouldn't let you out of the country if you had a fever of above 101. Or 100.7 or something like that. And so I had a thermometer with me, and I'm taking my temperature every few hours. And the day I'm supposed to leave, I pack up and I run across the street to buy some Tylenol, because I figure if I start to have a fever, I'm taking Tylenol and I'm getting out of here. So I run across the street and I come back, I take my temperature, and it's 98.6. I go, great. I take my temperature 15 minutes later, it's 98.9. I take my temperature a few minutes later and it's 99.2, and I'm going, oh my God. And it keeps climbing till it gets to about 99.4, and I am just freaked out, and then it starts to drop. I just run across the street and it was boiling hot. My temperature was elevated. How much I learned about human sleep physiology. So just to finish up, two things. One is snail sex. Okay, so the snail sex story, I mean, you know, you got to, right? So it turns out that there's a certain breed of snail that after an orgy on the beach, the female lays these egg sacs on the male, and the male carries them around for several months. And this scientist wanted to know, were the eggs that were being laid on the male's back, because there are males that do the heavy lifting during pregnancy, whatever you want to call it, but they're like the seahorse and things like that. But mostly it's their offspring. And this guy showed that it was 25 other males in addition to his. And why would a snail, I mean, snails are dumb, but they're not that dumb. And so the answer seems to be that, you know, it's like all for one and one for all, because somebody else is carrying his eggs, and so it's the best way to propagate. But I thought it was a good story. And Rick, oh gosh, don't use names here. Anyway, the guy who talked to me about it got to be a good pal, Rick Grossberg at UC Davis. So, so that's the snail story. Just to finish up, I'll tell you about Joe's big idea. So I have done and can do daily news. I can cover the stories that Jerry's talked about that come out in the newspaper, and you read it, you hear it on NPR, and you see it in the New York Times, and we all do the same story on the same day. And I got kind of tired of that. I think science is totally interesting, but as I said earlier today, that most, scientists always say that science is incremental and that the literature is self-correcting, which is another way of saying that most papers are trivial or wrong. And so I feel that there's a certain, we give papers more weight than they deserve by covering them as if they were news, because science papers. Now, that's not to say they're not interesting. They are interesting. But what happens is, if NPR covers it, New York Times covers it, Wall Street Journal covers it, all the blogs cover it, it suddenly seems like, oh, this must be important. Everybody's covering it. No, everybody's covering it because it came out today and there's a news page. And I'm saying, come on, let's all take a breath. I mean, this stuff is interesting, but because it's in science doesn't make it right or important. And I know that's not the case if you're going for tenure, but... So Joe's big idea was something I've been kicking around a long time, which is to sort of say, okay, let's talk about what it means to be a scientist and what it means to do science and what science can and can't do. And once you take away the need to make it important, ooh, look at that, important, then the world's your oyster, forgive my, because you can do anything. You can do any story that appeals to you because it's interesting and the science behind it is interesting. And so that's what I've been doing with Joe's big idea. And I mean, the first story I did was this guy, I'd read about this in Nature, and it was a year later. That's the other thing. You report on something you hear about, and then you never hear about it again. It's over. But this guy had done a thing where he had shown that he could infect a population of mosquitoes with the Wolbachia bacterium, and that once they were infected with Wolbachia, they could no longer transmit dengue. And so he was trying to use this to release Wolbachia. He was trying to release Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes that would then supplant non-Wolbachia-infected mosquitoes. This is before gene drive, and I'm not going to explain gene drive, but if you know what that is. And so I went to Australia. I talked my editor into letting me go to Australia, and it turned out to be a good call because the woman who was we were trying to convince this foundation to give us money at that time, and I didn't know this, but the woman who was the new president of the foundation had come from the Gates Foundation, and at the Gates Foundation, she had funded this study. So the first thing I'm saying is, here, look at the kind of stories I'm going to do. They're about things like this. And she went, oh, and that's the one I funded. She said, that didn't hurt. But this last 3 years have been remarkably successful and fun for me. The stories have been diverse, rewarding, and we can talk about them if you like. But it also has given me a chance to invite people into the process. And if you go to look on the webpage that I've got on Facebook, Joe's Big Idea, what I've got are this thing I call Friends of Joe's Big Idea, Faux Joby. And if you're not an official friend of Joe's Big Idea, you're a faux Joby. But people have been sending me stuff that they see that they think is interesting. And if I look at it and agree, I post it. And so I'm building this community of people who are helping to feed me interesting science stories that I might not see. And that the payback is, you can put on your resume, I work with Joe Palca. But I'm also hoping at some point, I've gotten more money from the same foundation, and they like this idea, to give a small, a few bucks to anybody who posts, just to say, hey, go buy a beer on me, that kind of thing. Because that's all I'm asking. Find an interesting link in a couple sentences. It doesn't, I'm not asking anybody to sweat a lot. But it's been so rewarding because people that I don't know and people that I barely know have been chipping in and helping. So you're all welcome. Go on the Facebook page, leave me a message there, or send me an email, jpalca@npr.org. Tell me you're interested, and we can go from there. So I'll stop, I'll drink my beer, and I'll be happy to take questions.